Welcome to e-lecture series Gyandoot, an initiative by Department of College Education, Government of Rajasthan. I'm Dr. Kiran, Associate Professor in English. In this session, I'm going to talk about one of the representative poems of 20th century, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This poem is written by T.S. Eliot, one of the most influential poets of the 20th century, who gave a new shape to the poetry uh, by challenging the romantic conventions. In this session, we will discuss in detail the theme, style, and structure of this very poem. But before talking about the poem, let's get ourselves introduced with the poet T.S. Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot. This is the full name of T.S. Eliot. He was born in 1888 at St. Louis, USA. Later on, he moved to England in 1914, and in 1927 he took the formal citizenship of Britain and renounced his American citizenship. As far as his literary career is concerned, he established himself as a poet by 1917 with the publication of his first collection of poems, Prufrock and Other Observations, and he achieved celebrity as a poet with the publication of his masterpiece, The Waste Land, in 1922. This great creative genius was awarded with Nobel Prize in 1948 for his outstanding poetic works. He died in 1965. As far as T.S. Eliot's contribution to the world of literature is concerned, it was not limited to the poems only. He experimented in the field of drama also, and he enriched the world of English literary criticism with his thought-provoking writings on the theory of poetry. Now, let's talk about his famous works. As far as his famous poems are concerned, to name a few, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which we will discuss in detail, and another one is The Waste Land, which was published in 1922, his poem The Hollow Man in 1925, and Four Quartets, which was published in 1943. And as I have just told you that he experimented in poetic dramas also, so he wrote several poetic dramas. To name a few, Murder in the Cathedral, which was published in 1935, The Family Reunion, which was published in 1939, and The Cocktail Party, published in 1949. Any discussion about T.S. Eliot's creative output will be incomplete if we will not talk about his contribution in the field of literary criticism. He has several essays and articles to his credit, but here I would like to make a special mention of his two thought-provoking essays. One is Tradition and Individual Talent, which was published in 1919. This is the very essay where T.S. Eliot talks about his famous impersonality, theory of impersonality of poetry. And another essay is The English Metaphysical Poets, which was published in 1921. And in this essay, T.S. Eliot discussed the concept of the objective correlative, that how the concept of objective correlative, which is explained as a set of images, as a chain of events to give impersonal touch or to present the the events which are happening around in an impersonal way. We will talk both these concepts, the impersonality of poetry and objective correlative, with reference to this very poem, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. As an influential poet of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot uh, wrote his poems with a desire to bring poetry out from the land of rainbows and daffodils as presented by the Romantics to the world of factories, chimneys, and pubs, and all those things which are happening in the modern world. And so he has done very effectively, because he believed that a great poet in writing of himself writes of his age, and the same is true of his poems. Almost all his poems portray modernism and complexity. The second important feature of his poetry is impersonality of poetry. This very concept of impersonality of poetry is a very unique uh, concept, which is T.S. Eliot's contribution to the world of English literary criticism as a poet critic. Um, as I have told you that T.S. Eliot challenged the Romantic tradition, and the Romantic tradition uh, accepted poetry as a process of outburst of personal emotions. But T.S. Eliot believed that that poetry should be impersonal. Subjectivity should not be there in a poem, because if subjectivity is there, then a poet can never be the well-informed spectator of the times which he are presenting in his poems. So to give an impartial view of the society, to give an impartial view of the complexity which is there all around, he suggested this theory of impersonality of poetry. And to create this impersonality of poetry, he suggested another important concept, that is objective correlative, which is explained by T.S. Eliot as a set of objects, as a chain of events which are introduced as a formula for a particular emotion. Here I would like to say that as the poem which we will discuss, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, this very poem talks about the complexity. This poem talks about the ugliness of the modern world. But this ugliness and complexity of the modern world is not presented through any dialogue, any story by Prufrock, but this very emptiness, or this very hollowness, or this very ugliness, or this very complexity is presented in this very poem through a series of certain images, through a series of certain symbols. So the fourth important feature of his poetry is symbols and imagery, because he used symbols and images as an objective correlative for impersonality of poetry. Last but not the least, his poems are replete with allusions. So what is an allusion? An allusion means any quote or any reference to any other literary text. In T.S. Eliot's poems, there are references and quotes from Bible, from Shakespearean plays, from Dante's Divine Comedy, and from many other works, literary works. So just on the basis of the excessive use of allusions and the references from other literary texts, the famous critic I.A. Richards called T.S. Eliot's poetry as a poetic shorthand. So This is how T.S. Eliot has tried to give a new shape to the 20th century poetry with these concepts of impersonality of poetry, objective correlative, with the use of very striking imagery and along with illusions. Now let's talk about the poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was first published in June 1915 in Poetry, a magazine of verse, and later on it was included in the collection Prufrock and Other Observations, which was published in 1917. As far as the theme or the key concern or the key idea of this poem is concerned, the poem deals with the emptiness, the hollowness, the emotional and spiritual sterility and ugliness of modern civilization. And this emptiness or this ugliness of the modern civilization is projected through a character Prufrock, as the name is given in the very title of the poem. This Prufrock is a citizen of Eliot's poetic world, and he is presented as a representative of disillusioned modern world. Now let's talk something more about the setting of this poem. As the title of the poem suggests that it is a love song. But here I just want to make a special mention that T.S. Eliot revolted against the romantic tradition of poetry. So this poem is not going to be a love song in conventional sense. So the very irony is reflected in the title of the poem. Now the second important thing is the setting of the poem. The whole of the poem is not set in a dreamland, is not set in a land of rainbows or flowers or daffodils, as just like a conventional love song, but it is set in a dirty city. It is set in a city which is clogged with fog, a city in which the poet opens the poem with the portrayal of the time of evening, which is compared with a patient etherized upon table. So through this image of the evening etherized upon table, the poet has introduced the atmosphere of inactivity. So this is the setting of the poem, and in this very foggy and dirty setting, this poem is presented in the form of a dramatic monologue. And as we all know that in the conventional dramatic monologue, there must be a speaker. No doubt a speaker is there. Alfred Prufrock is the speaker, and just like the conventional dramatic monologue, an unidentified listener is there. But a close reading of the poem reveals to us that this listener is not going to be any male or female. Perhaps it is the inner self of the Prufrock. So this poem is not like the conventional dramatic monologue. This poem is there as an interior monologue. And in this internal debate, the poet has tried to reveal the psyche of the modern man who is living in an emotionally barren world. The poem opens with an epigraph. So let's first know what an epigraph is. An epigraph is a literary device in the form of a quotation or an extract from a poem, usually placed at the beginning of a document or a text to generate a specific context for the text. And in this very poem, the epigraph is a quotation which is taken from Canto 27th of famous Italian poet Dante's work Inferno. And this quote is in Italian language. And in the quote is taken from Inferno, and Inferno talks about a pilgrim's journey through hell, where he meets various sinners who narrate their sufferings. And the lines which are used as epigraph in this poem, they are spoken by a character Guido de Montefeltro, who tells the pilgrim about the secret of his punishment in hell with this faith that no one can go out of hell, so this pilgrim will not be in a position to talk about his secret to any other fellow. So this very epigraph positions the world of Prufrock, which is presented in the poem, in dialogue with Dante's hell. This is how this epigraph is used to set the tone, to set the context of the poem, which talks about the modern life, or the dirtiness or the complexity of the modern life, which is compared with the with hell. And if we attempt to summarize the contents of the poem, it's not an easy task. But because this poem is not a narrative poem, Prufrock is not telling a story about himself. The poem is a collage of thoughts, wishes, fears, and images as a part of T.S. Eliot's intention to use the objective correlative. So now just to have a clear understanding of the contents of the poem, first we'll talk about that who Prufrock is and how he looks. Prufrock is presented as a slightly bald fellow with thin arms and legs, and he is also presented as an indecisive man who is always anxious about making the wrong choices. And this very indecisive man's mind moves through a series of thoughts. And how his mind moves through the series of thoughts, it can be divided into three parts. The first, at the first, as the first range of his thoughts, we can say there is the cityscape, where Prufrock talks about half-deserted streets, restless nights in one-night cheap hotels. He talks about sawdust restaurants, and above all, in the opening part of the poem, there is repetitive use of the image of the fog, yellow fog, which appears as a cat and rubs against the window panes and gathers at the drains and the chimneys. So the city clogged with the yellow fog is presented there. Then his thoughts move from that foggy city to the interiors of the social gatherings. And in these social gatherings, Prufrock talks about the poor who live in these very hostile streets where those clubs or those restaurants are situated. Then he talks about the middle class people who sit in the drawing rooms drinking tea and talking of Michelangelo. So through this portrayal of the poor and the middle class people, Eliot is talking about the social divide in the contemporary society. And the third range of the thoughts is the world of vague ocean images, which appears towards the end of the poem, where Prufrock imagines himself to be in an underground cavern with the sounds of mermaids singing. So this very image shows shows Prufrock's escape from the harsh realities of life. Through the course of the poem, through the movement of Prufrock's thoughts from cityscape to the interiors of the social gatherings and the vague images of the sea, uh, the poet gives expression to Prufrock's strong desire, and his strong desire is to communicate an overwhelming question. And throughout the poem, what this overwhelming question is, this is not directly mentioned. From the clues available in the poem, we can say that this overwhelming question is a marriage proposal for his lady love. And throughout the poem, Prufrock is in fears. He has a sense of insecurity that he will not be able to propose his lady love, because he is always worried about how the people will judge him. And these very fears, this very sense of insecurity makes him indecisive. So he is unable to give voice to that very overwhelming question and to force the moment to its crisis, because he feels, or he is so much worried that if he will communicate this proposal to his lady love, he will be misunderstood, and he is not brave enough to face this crisis. So, through the thoughts of the Prufrock, through his fears, uh, in this very poem, T.S. Eliot has handled the themes which project the complexity or emptiness or spiritual sterility of the modern society. They are loneliness and alienation, then there is indecision and inadequacy, boredom and barrenness, and last but not the least, the theme of frustration is also there. On your screen, I have given some lines or quotes from the poem itself, which directly indicate the very theme. For example, the last line on your screen is, I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. This is how this character Prufrock gives expression to his frustration, to his disgust that he has not done anything worthwhile throughout his life. Now, let's talk about the style of the poem, that how this very complexity of the society, which is projected through the portrayal of the fears and wishes and dreams and thoughts of Prufrock, they are very effectively presented through a set of images, a set of quotes, a set of references from other literary texts also. As I have already mentioned, that the use of allusions is a very a special feature of T.S. Eliot's poems. So in this poem, as we have discussed, that the very epigraph is a quotation from Dante's poem Inferno. Then the reference to the overwhelming question. This very phrase, the overwhelming question, is the title of James Fenimore Cooper's novel. Happens in Cooper's novel The Pioneers. Then in the course of the poem, if you will have a close reading of the poem, you will find that there are references to Bible through stories of John the Baptist and Lazarus. And Shakespeare's Hamlet is also referred there when Prufrock says that I am not Prince Hamlet. Then similarly, there is a reference to Shakespeare's Twelfth Night also. And in the last part of the poem, where Prufrock is talking about mermaid singing, here it seems that T.S. Eliot is referring to Homer's Odyssey. So this is how this poem is also replete with allusions, just like all other poems by T.S. Eliot. The complexity of the modern society in this poem is not only presented through the thought processes or the fears of the character Prufrock, but it is also projected through the very structure of the poem. That this poem is not following any fixed structure, any fixed line of length of lines or the stanzas. So the varied lengths of the line and stanzas, they are in tune with Prufrock's continuing digressions, which happen through the course of the poem. And another important feature or the stylistic device is that these very digressions of the speaker, they add a sort of touch of stream of consciousness. So we can say the stream of consciousness style of narration is there. And last but not the least, the most important, the series of symbols, which add beauty, which add meaning to this very poem, that how fog, yellow fog is used as a symbol of confusion and inactivity. And then there is the metaphor of cat. Cat is, fog is compared to a cat. Then yellow smoke. Then lastly, there are the images of sea also. So this is how this, in this poem, T.S. Eliot has tried to capture the complexity and emptiness of the modern world, not only in terms of its theme, but in terms of its style and structure also. Now, let's recapitulate. As we have discussed, this poem is a dramatic monologue, and to be more specific, we can say it's an internal monologue where a sort of internal debate is going on in the mind of the speaker, that is Prufrock, and there is an unidentified listener, and as we have told, this unidentified listener seems to be the inner self of Prufrock. And through a dramatic monologue, this character is located in a bleak section of a foggy and dirty city, and in this very setting of the dirty city, the poet has presented the loneliness, alienation, indecision, inadequacy, and boredom which is prevalent in the modern society. And these themes are introduced in a very colloquial tone, conversational style, through unusual imagery, metaphors, and symbols. Irony is also used, and the poem is replete with allusions. There are references to several other literary texts, and there is flexibility of versification, means the irregularity in the length and the stanzaic pattern of the society. So I hope now you have a clear idea of about this poem, that what this poem is all about, who Prufrock is, and what is special in T.S. Eliot's approach towards poetry as a portrayal of life. So keep reading, keep exploring more about this great literary artist who captured the spirit of the age. Thank you.